Hello, welcome to Financial Insider Weekly. I'm your host, Michael Gray, CPA. My guest today is William Mitchell, and I'm just going to call him Bill. And Bill is a certified public accountant. He represents taxpayers in IRS collections, audits, and appeals, and before the U.S. Tax Court. He has offices in Santa Cruz and San Jose, California. He has also been licensed to practice before the United States Tax Court since 1978. Bill graduated from Santa Clara University in 1962, and after his service in the U.S. Army, he worked at the Internal Revenue Service from 1966 through 1971, and has worked in public accounting from 1971 to the present. In his other life, Bill plays baseball, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's like an amateur league,
Right. I've
an adult
participated
league.
in semi-pro leagues when I was a little more agile and younger, and then they have these leagues that now they're baseball leagues for 25 and older and 30 and older. And once a year down in Arizona, they have tournaments for people 60 and over and 65 and over. So I'm still eligible to do some of those things as well.
Well, congratulations, that's great. Okay, well today I've asked Bill to tell us about the process for appeals and tax court litigation after a tax audit. So in other words, this is about what happens after a tax audit, and you don't agree with what the IRS results are in their report. This is a complex subject. We're talking about really legal issues and so forth. I don't tend to back off from these things, just be aware though that it is. And Bill went to a lot of effort to get his certification to practice before the tax court and has a lot of experience. And so we're not going to be able to cover everything today. And so this is intended to be the beginning of a conversation that you may have with your own representative when you're dealing with IRS appeals. Okay, so Bill, thanks again for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay. So the IRS audit is done. And you feel, oh, big sigh of relief. Well, at least the agent's out of your hair for right now. But now you get this letter in the mail. Or I guess quite often the IRS agent has a meeting with you, isn't that right?
They can. They generally inform you of what their proposals are going to be with respect to their examination.
Yeah.
And then their report will come in written form showing you their proposals and the tax that is going to be increased on your account.
So part of what is going on is that the agent sort of has the initial authority, if you will, to write this report, but then it has to be reviewed by their manager? That's
correct. Although over the years I've found that sometimes the report will come out and it's an increase in tax, and the taxpayer and the taxpayer's representative at that point are either confused, mystified, or what to do next. And so that's when if they're not agreeing with what took place or they want further explanations, you can contact the agent and have a meeting with the agent's supervisor as well as the agent to see if you can still resolve the issue before the final assessment comes down on the tax.
Have you dealt with many reports where there are issues that were really a surprise to the taxpayer as far as what the results were?
Well, not so much the issues, it's the amount of tax that's involved.
Oh,
that's
okay.
a surprise to the taxpayer, that what the agent is suggesting during the course of the audit may seem somewhat benign at the time, but then when you look at what the tax score is on it, that can be a real eye-opener, and sometimes it's a significant amount of tax that's due.
Okay. So what's the next step when you get one of these reports?
Well, if you're in an unagreed position with the agent and you've met with the agent's group manager, if the group, sometimes the group manager will say, fine, the agent that made the determinations, I'm in complete accord with his findings, and then at that point there's nothing more for the taxpayer's representative to do until the IRS sends out a notice, and they'll send out a notice of the agent's report, and it will be accompanied by a letter that will advise the client of his rights to an administrative appeal. And you can appeal the findings of the agent, and you have to do it within 30 days to the appellate division of IRS. And in this area, the appellate division of IRS is located in San Francisco. At one time, they had appeals divisions in offices like Walnut Creek, San Jose, and San Francisco, and it was generally the appeals division would handle the case where the client's residence or business was located. Now, we're all required to take that wonderful trip to 101st Street in San Francisco and go through the construction works and all the traffic that's involved in getting to the appellate office.
Okay. So, I mean, well, first of all, we've got a pretty short fuse here, 30 days. What do they do what if the person's on vacation or something?
Well, if after 30 days you haven't filed a formal protest, the service can just proceed with what's called a 90-day letter then, and they'll send you out another letter saying you have 90 days from the date that's on this letter to petition to the tax court. In the alternative, if you've been on vacation, you come back and feel, oh my gosh, the 30 days have expired, you can contact the appeals office and explain it, and sometimes they will allow additional time for you to get the formal protest filed with them. And so you have to kind of work with that and be flexible. And again, if the appellate officer is rigid and said, hey, you missed, then your next step is to file a petition with the United States Tax Court, but you don't do that until the IRS sends out this notice that says you have a deficiency and you have 90 days to file your petition with the tax court.
Yeah. So a lot of times this stuff isn't written in stone, and I've received like 90-day letters, and in some cases I've been able to get them to just fix it without having to go to
right. They
court.
Can if there's a misunderstanding, they can rescind those. But I never like, in my experience, to rely on,
I don't either.
Someone's generosity in the rescission process.
Scares me.
So the simplest in my thought process is to file the petition and deal with it directly and go from there, because even once a petition is filed with the tax court, the case is then assigned to IRS counsel, and during the course of meeting with the IRS counsel, they will say, all right, why don't you go back to the appeals division, and especially if you've never had an appeals meeting before that, to see if this matter can't be resolved before you start involving with all the tax court proceedings.
Right. So, just for our viewers to understand, I mean, the tax court is an expensive process for the taxpayer, but it's also expensive for the government because they have attorneys that they have to have work on these cases and so forth too. So, anyway, but we've really sort of zipped past the appeals, so let's come back to appeals for a moment, and particularly the initial protest. So, why don't you explain a little bit about this protest that we're talking about, and what does a protest mean? And
well, a protest is just a written a letter to the appeals office, and in there's certain things that you include, like the tax years involved, the taxpayers, obviously their names and social security numbers, or the business's ID number, whoever the taxpayer happens to be, and then the issues that are or need resolution, and generally the format for that is, if there are factual things that need to be explained, you write the protest in a format of facts, law, and argument. And in that process, you would cite in the law process the code sections, the tax cases, or everything that's in support of your position. So it requires some expertise, although, believe it or not, in the most rudimentary of circumstances, if a taxpayer decided they were going to do that themselves and say, I do not agree, I appeal this case, the service in certain instances will honor that and regard that as a formal protest and eligible for the appeal proceedings in the IRS. I don't recommend that because I think you're starting off on the wrong foot, and I think it leaves an impression that you're not giving this the full dignity at this point that the IRS would believe that it concerns.
Yeah. I was just related to some of the newsletters that I write. I was looking at a particular case. I can't even remember the details right now, but basically the taxpayer was clearly disregarding, if you will, the Internal Revenue Code. And the taxpayer represented himself before the tax court, and then represented himself before the Ninth Circuit, who actually did look at it, but didn't have a full hearing. And basically, they just said, the tax court's right. I don't, what's the problem here? We're sorry. We're going to rule against you. But sometimes you can actually waste a lot of time, if you don't really get advice, because, although it may seem to you that this position is immoral, it's what the Internal Revenue Code says, and so that's what the courts or the IRS is going to conclude.
Well, that's right. In fact, when someone represents themselves, they call that pro se, and it's been my experience when people represent themselves as pro se that the service will give them extended courtesies that they might not to give to a professional representative who's supposed to know all those things, so they'll expand on that. But while that's going on, at the same time, the result is still not going to be a favorable result when it's all said and done. Now, in other words, they'll make the person aware of all their rights and all their avenues, but at the same time, hey, if your case doesn't have merit, then they're still going to decide against you. So that's why it's better to get anytime you're at appeals to have professional representation.
Okay. Well, what happens after you file this protest?
Okay, after the protest is filed and it's timely, within 30 days, you'll be contacted by the appeals office. They acknowledge that they received your formal protest, and then they will arrange a meeting with you, and this meeting will be held in most instances in San Francisco, as I stated. If you are a Silicon Valley business or a Silicon Valley person and everything's in San Jose, they still have offices available in San Jose, and if the IRS travel allowances will permit, they will try and make it as convenient as possible. But my experience recently is, hey, you're going to San Francisco every time, so you can expect that will be the case. So you have to contend not only with the issues of the case when you get there, but also someone like me who's somewhat of a country bumpkin in traffic, you have to contend with all that and getting up to San Francisco and finding a place to park and then go to the meeting.
Right. All right. So how is it different when you're talking with somebody from appeals from when you're dealing with like an IRS agent?
Okay, well, appeals officers generally have long experience with the service. Maybe, when I say long experience, maybe they went to service 10 years or longer, and they've been revenue agents, and they have the benefit of that time and getting wisdom on weighing the merits of issues, and also appeals can consider what's known as the hazards of litigation, whereas the revenue agents cannot. And the hazards of litigation deal with situations where the service actually assigns a probability to an issue and will present the matter in that fashion. For example, I had a case once where the issues went, it was just a number of issues, and the auditor had listed them as alphabetically from A to M. And so as I sat down with the appeals officer, we went through it item by item and say item A, the appeals officer said, well, I think the service has a 50% chance of prevailing on that issue, so we will settle that one for 50% of if it were a deduction, and so on down the line. Now, not every appeals officer operates in that fashion, but they do consider what is known as the hazards of litigation. For example, if there's tax court cases that bear on the matter, then there's a conflict between circuits, then that might have some effect on their decision. But the one thing that really controls in that regard is that what's the tax court decisions in their area. And we're in the Ninth Circuit here in the Western United States, and that encompasses Washington, Oregon, Idaho, California, Nevada, Arizona, I think Montana. But if you have cases that are in the Ninth Circuit that are covered by the matter that's being scrutinized by them or under review, then that's going to be a controlling factor. But on the other hand, if you have a case that's still what we call a case of first impression, and it's one of these things where nobody knows exactly what the decision will be, then the service may want to settle the matter for less than the full amount that's on the revenue agent's report.
Yeah. So part of what we're saying is the IRS may be talking, I guess you could almost say it's horse trading dollars.
Well, they won't accept that. In other words,
but we're not. I guess you wouldn't call it that. But
we won't call it that. But it's got to be a reasoned decision,
I see.
and so they will. It's supported by a thought. But if in the layman's terms, they'll say, "Hey, they're horse trading issues." No, it's a little more than that. Although to the layman, it may appear that way in the end.
Okay. Should a taxpayer represent himself or herself at appeals?
No, I think that's a mistake, because the appeals officers are going to be dealing with issues that, if they haven't been resolved at the agent level, there's got to be some complex part to it, either factually or legally, and how it meets the requirements of the Internal Revenue Code. And so I think that's beyond the pale of most taxpayers, and it should be, because if you're not in our business, who wants to get concerned with that? You just want to conduct your business affairs and conduct your life in a manner that's fairly organized. So I think at that point you really have to have representation to get the matter resolved properly.
Do you think the taxpayer should even go to appeals?
I like to have taxpayers go to appeals. Now, I think we've covered this before, and I'm unusual in that regard, because when I get called into cases, generally, I am not prepared the tax return, and some of the background information that the appeals officer may ask for, I don't have available to me. And it's always amazing to me is that we talked earlier about having everything in order and having all your documents. I'm amazed when you get to the appeals office, the appellate officer almost invariably will do their own examination, and they will ask questions that the examining agent, who was at the audit level, did not ask, and all of a sudden you've got to respond to something that's entirely new. So that's one of the hazards of going to appeals, is that while you can get a favorable resolve if the matters go that way, you can also run into a situation where new issues are raised by the appellate conferee, and you have to address those as well.
All right. Now, I've heard and I've talked to you about this before. I just want to talk about it very briefly, though, because we need to get onto the tax court and we don't have a lot of time left. But the IRS evidently has been telling some people that we're not going to listen to any arguments that weren't raised as far as your position and support and so forth, that weren't raised during the examination itself. Would you like to make any comments about that?
Yes, I mean, I have a case that occurred, and finally we got the point across that, and the service recognized it. But what you mentioned here, I guess, is something that's more recent than
yes.
that. And I really wonder about that, because if the appeals officers can raise new issues, then it seems to me that the taxpayer should have an equal footing. So I guess we'll just have to wait to see how that plays out in the cases that are coming forward from this point.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of it is, as far as I know, the IRS has no legal grounds and stating that. I've heard of things like that, like when people get to an actual appeal decision at the Court of Appeals, that they won't hear arguments that haven't been, in the lower court.
Right.
But to say it so early in the process just seems sort of silly.
And appeals is an administrative proceeding, and it's not with a judge or anything. What you're doing is meeting with an appeals officer in an office, and so you write a formal protest to get there, but the meetings are somewhat informal and to discuss all the issues. So it doesn't have all the requirements that once you get past that level, and then you're dealing with rules of tax court and all kinds of procedural rules, you don't have those at the appeals division. Once you've written the formal protest, you're in pretty good shape. That's your ticket to the meeting, and then the meeting can be conducted in just the same manner that you and I are speaking here.
Okay. Well, we need to move on. So what happens if you're not able to reach a satisfactory, well, let's just say a mutually acceptable or something, resolution at appeals?
Well, that can be very disappointing to begin with. But at that point, you agree to disagree, and then the appellate officer will see that a 90-day letter is sent to you, and the 90-day letter is also called a notice of deficiency, and that gives the taxpayer and the taxpayer's representative 90 days to file a petition with the United States Tax Court. And then that being done, you're off to your tax court proceedings. So, and it can take, these things aren't done immediately. It takes even though you're doing 90 days to get your petition to the tax court, it can be some time before you're contacted at that point by the tax court personnel of the service, which are called division counsel, and calling you in again for meetings much the same as you would be meeting with the appeals officer, only now it's a little more stern and you're talking about procedural issues. Okay.
Now, is the tax court the only choice as far as getting your case heard?
Well, you can also go to district court. You go to tax court. By going to tax court, the taxpayer doesn't have to make any payments in advance to get there. In other words, the service has proposed that you owe this amount and you're still contesting that amount. You can, in the alternative, you can go to district court, and district court, you make the payment of the tax or pay a bond, and then you're permitted to have your case heard in district court. The other thing is that tax court is conducted before a judge who's very specialized in taxation. District court, you have a jury trial, and I've been in district court as a percipient witness and looked at the jury sometimes involving tax issues, and you really wonder whether these types of issues can be digested by people who don't have a tax background.
Okay. Who's licensed to practice in the tax court?
Well, attorneys and non-attorneys who are licensed to practice, such as myself. And the way I became licensed to practice is that a test in those days was held annually in Washington, D.C. at the tax court, and you go back and the questions cover the Internal Revenue Code, federal rules of civil procedure, and tax court rules. And those are things that most CPAs don't know anything about. So it took me 2 shots at it. The first time was more or less an orientation, and the second time I was able to pass. And in those 2 years, 96 people took the examination and 6 passed. So it's not the biggest giveaway that has ever been conducted in the way of examinations. And also it's one of those few examinations where you pour through everything and you put down your pencil to review your answers, and the person that's conducting the examination says time's up. So it's a rigorous examination.
Okay. We got about 3 minutes left. So why don't you talk a little bit about what advice you have related to going to tax court?
Well, tax court's an uncertain forum. You don't go to tax court unless you feel that you have a very strong case, and that's the reason why you go. You don't go there for frivolous things like, the tax laws are unconstitutional or anything like that, because you just are not going to be heard. In fact, they'll slap further penalties on you. But the taxpayers and taxpayers' representatives should be aware that it's an uncertain forum. And I've been in cases where at the end of the case, the judge, and these judges are very stern, they will send out messages equally to the IRS attorneys and to the taxpayers' representatives of their stern thoughts about things. But the idea being that no matter what's done at that point, you still have to finish the trial and write briefs. And when the briefs are written, it takes about 9 months for the court to digest all that, and they'll come out with a decision. And sometimes the decision will be 180 degrees from what was expected from the presentations in the tax court proceeding where people were testifying. So it's something that is to be regarded, I guess, with a great deal of care and concern.
Right. And so again, the preparation you really want a very strong representative in tax court, and so you need somebody who's very familiar. And I guess you actually work in partnership with attorneys many times when you do this.
I work with attorneys who I've not been schooled in matters of cross-examination and those types of things, but we'll divide up the witnesses, and most of the easy ones I take, and then but it takes someone. It's a very special talent to be able to conduct an examination of witnesses to get all the facts out in the tax court, because that's what you're getting there. You're not arguing law. You're just saying, hey, these are the facts of the case, and then the law issues are conducted in the briefs. But where you really have to think on your feet is when the government produces a witness, and that witness is testifying, and now you've got to cross-examine. That's a talent.
Okay. Bill, I want to thank you so much for coming and talking with us about this. Folks, I hope you get some appreciation for what happens after the audit and the appeal process. Find some excellent representation if you ever have to deal with this. And we'll wish you good luck. And we'll see you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.